shortly streaming on our YouTube live streaming service, which you can find if you Google VK3AML 17 July 2021. That's if you want to look in on this, or if you have trouble with receiving, your receiving's not the best, try Googling us on the YouTube live stream by putting the phrase into Google search VK3AML 17 July 2021. You should find us there. And tonight I'll be dealing with the use of balanced audio lines in ham shacks to reduce RF feedback and hum loops. Then we'll be having a presentation on outrageous claims made in the audiophile community. Everything from taping coloured rocks to your USB cords to make them of superior audio. Yes, I am not joking. And then at the end there'll be a lecture by the author of a recent book on the life of Dr. Lee DeForest. So that's coming up on tonight's replay and presentation, which we've been doing, and my predecessors back through 3ASE and 3AML, the original 3AML, were doing up to 45 years ago. This is VK3 Alpha Mike Lima on 147.475. Just checking that everything's working okay there, yeah, it's all drawing the usual current. And via YouTube Live. I should explain, we finally ironed out a glitch in the YouTube webcam camera tonight, so that on my live appearances I won't look like if I have rosacea. Apparently the saturation control on the webcam was wound right up to the point where I looked like I was going to die of high blood pressure or something. At least on the live part of the transmission you'll see it a little bit better, but the pre-recorded section of the transmission you shall hear now. VK3AML, and with the time at 9:30, it's time to start the usual Saturday night replay. So in that time we've managed to set one world DX record back in 2005 between Mount Barrow outside Launceston, Tasmania, and Mount Wellington. And that was followed in January of this year, 2021, with myself, Dave 3ASC, Steve 3SL, and Steve's son Henry, VK3FACT, establishing the first VK3 to VK7, that is Tasmania to Victoria light beam link from Deal Island back to the mainland, where Chris Morley and Ralph Edgar, 3WRE and 3CJK, I think they were respectively, were manning the other end of the light beam at Blackwarry on the Grand Ridge Road. It's been a pretty difficult week for most people. I'm sure I'm not alone in that. We're now in lockdown again. I appear to have a captive audience, which may or may not be a good thing. And I just hope that nobody has been directly affected by COVID. I have quite a bad cough myself and have done for a few days. I'll be going for a test for COVID. I don't think it's COVID. It's probably just a plain old-fashioned winter cold. One thing that has happened this week is that I've now wired this entire ham radio shack for balanced lines. For those of you who don't know what balanced audio lines are, you use typically a transformer like this, a 600 ohm to 600 ohm high quality audio transformer, to separate the audio output from the input of your, the audio output, for example, of your computer from the audio input of your radio, thereby avoiding the chance of circulating earths by keeping the two windings separately, one leading to the transmitter, the other back to the audio generating equipment. But furthermore, let's get into the implications of line balancing. This is something that Bob Heil of Heil Audio brought up in a talk that I transmitted a few weeks ago. And the idea of balanced lines is that basically you have a three-wire system between one audio component and another, one with positive phase, one with negative phase, and one with earth. And the idea of that is because the two audio phases going down your audio lines in the shack are balanced, that any induced inductive or capacitive noise in the line will be balanced out when the signal reaches the other end of the line. And that has particular application these days in avoiding circulating earth hum. You'll notice that the output of my signal, at least via the YouTube stream, is completely clean of hum. And more to the point, in an amateur radio, ham radio shack, where your transmitter may be only a matter of less than a metre from your audio equipment, it's important not to induce RF currents back into your audio system and cause RF feedback. And these balancing transformers, known in the industry sometimes as an audio balun, B-A-L-U-N, are quite important. Now, I think it would be suitable at this point to read a part of a chapter from this book, the Audiophiles Project Source Book by G. Randy Sloan, who is a respected engineer. And we'll talk about these transformers, and I'll flash up some circuit diagrams to explain what we're talking about. To balun or not to balun? That is the question. What the heck is a balun? Balun is actually a colloquial term formed from the expression balanced to unbalanced. It originally referred to a type of transformer that would accept a balanced input signal and through transformer action convert it into a signal with unbalanced output or a single-ended signal. Presently, Balun is used to describe any device, transformer or solid-state circuit, capable of receiving a balanced signal or driving a balanced signal. In other words, a Balun is a device that converts a balanced signal to an unbalanced signal, or a device that converts an unbalanced signal to a balanced signal. Baluns designed to accept a balanced input signal and convert it to a single-ended signal are called balanced receivers. Baluns designed to accept a single-ended input signal and convert it to a balanced output signal, a push-pull output signal, are called balanced drivers. In some cases, the term Balun is used to describe the entire unbalanced to balanced or unbalanced system in an audio chain. Before proceeding any further into Balun discussions, let's examine the need for balanced signal lines. Balanced signal lines contain 3 wires: a signal common, or earth, the non-inverted audio program signal, and the inverted audio program signal. Signal cables of any type are susceptible to undesirable noise pickup from numerous types of radiated fields, RF and lower frequency. Regardless of what type of stray noise may be picked up by a connection cable, the noise will be common mode, meaning that the electrical field cutting the cable wire will induce the same level and phase of noise contamination into all of the wires simultaneously. If such common mode noise is injected into a balanced signal line, the balanced receiver will ignore the noise content and only amplify the difference signals of the program material. In other words, the common mode rejection characteristic of an op-amp or balanced transformer, and here's your balanced transformer, can be used to reject the common mode noise while cleanly amplifying the audio signal. In addition, since the balanced receiver is looking at the difference signal contained in the 2 audio signal lines, the circuit common reference is not actually used in the signal extraction process. So a host of hum problems, that is, from ground loops and various grounding problems, can be isolated from one piece of audio equipment to another. In the not-too-distant past, Baluns were used almost exclusively for professional audio systems due to the need for long stretches of microphone and signal cable across the stage area to a variety of soundboards and amplifiers. In recent years, however, audiophiles have begun to incorporate Baluns into domestic audio systems. As with any new innovation into the audio fields, there have been fantastic claims made in detailing the benefits derived from incorporating these balanced lines throughout a domestic audio system. Are any of these claims true? Well, I would claim that in a ham shack with high RF fields, it probably is true. There's an old proverb that states, "If it ain't broke, don't fix it." Is your domestic audio system quiet and relatively free of excessive noise or hum? If your answer is yes, then you don't need to go with balanced signal lines. If your answer is no, then consider a few other things first. Are you using a good grade of shielded signal cable throughout your system? Are all of your system components grounded properly? Have you attempted to cure such problems in more conventional manners? The point is, the majority of problems resulting in excessive noise and hum in a domestic hi-fi system can be traced to easily remedied faults that should be corrected regardless of whether you or not you incorporate balanced signal lines. Balanced lines are a good choice if you have long runs of signal wire, audio signal wire. For example, you might want to use a Balun system if you have one piece of equipment that's located a significant physical distance away from your main system. They're also a good choice for eliminating a stubborn ground loop problem that nothing else seems to fix. Balanced input receivers and output drivers should always be incorporated into professional audio equipment that will be receiving or sending line level or signal level information to other pieces of equipment. Baluns are often a good option for musical instrument amplifiers as well. Baluns can be divided into two major categories: the transformer or solid-state versions. Regarding transformer-type baluns, I have to honestly admit that I don't have much personal experience with them. The writer doesn't, but I do. Other than my knowledge that they function well in professional audio equipment. Based on the market specifications and the feedback I've received from satisfied users, I believe their performance in domestic applications is probably excellent. In contrast to solid-state baluns, transformer baluns do not require any type of operational power, so they're an excellent choice for anyone wanting to construct a passive preamplifier system. Passive preamplifiers will be discussed in another section. Well, we won't go into that tonight. The main disadvantage with transformer baluns is their cost. They are rather pricey. Well, they are retail, but these 600 ohm to 600 ohm isolation transformers I have found at ham radio fests or ham fests for something in the order of $5 to $10 each. So when you see these, very handy for audio, particularly if you're running digital systems from computers and you want to interface your computer to your radio. Solid-state baluns provide excellent performance and are very inexpensive. They're easy for the homebrew hobbyist to construct, and they're very versatile and flexible for a wide variety of applications. Baluns are sort of trendy right now. There have been a number of articles written about how the noise levels in domestic hi-fi systems have been lowered by maybe 6 dB or even 10 dB. But how good were the noise levels to start with, one wonders? Was the improvement audible? I'm a passive spectator in this controversy. I neither recommend nor reject the installation of baluns. I'm a practical person. I recommend that if you have a problem a balun can fix, then use it. Regarding the various manufacturers of audio equipment, the only thing they're interested in is that baluns are in vogue at the present, so you'll see a lot of modern hi-fi equipment with balanced input and output capabilities. You be the judge and have fun with your experimentation. So in summary, if you're a radio ham who has problems with RF feedback or with hum, an isolation transformer somewhere in your audio line between your audio amplifier or your mixer and your transmitter, or indeed your computer and your transmitter if you're transmitting WSJT or JT65A or even EasyPal multi-subcarrier slow scan, which is broader bandwidth, a balun can be advantageous. And we certainly have quite a few lengthy wires running around here, and when we operate HF, particularly AM on HF, RF feedback has been a great problem that has been solved by these audio isolation transformers, otherwise known as baluns. This is VK3 Alpha Mike Lima with the usual Saturday night transmissions. The intent of these transmissions, incidentally, is to get discussions going. One of the things that I've noticed about amateur discussions of recent years is that there seems to be some sort of an impression going around. I'm not so sure that it has any foundation, that HF conditions are appalling. That is not my experience. I've been listening on a lot of worldwide software-defined, web-based software-defined radios, and if you so much as put 5 watts up in a carrier here on 20 metres, you will hear it at some time of the day in America, almost every day. I think the problem is that increasingly people have forgotten how to call CQ or how to reply to CQ calls. Because if everybody is listening and nobody is talking, there will be no communication and the impression will be given that the bands are dead. And I think that's a major part of what's happening. Now, in my attempt to liven things up, I throw cats among the pigeons from time to time with these transmissions. So what I thought I'd do is talk about carrying on from that previous discussion, talk about common audio myths. And in previous weeks of these presentations on 147.475 and on YouTube Live, where you can find us to look in, if you dial up VK3AML 17 July 2021. That is Google VK3AML 17 July 2021, and you should find our YouTube live stream. If you're having trouble with the transmission on 2 metres, if you're in a shadow area from where we're transmitting from in Burwood East, or if the signal's not too good, if you have some sort of an audio problem with your NBFM receiver on 2 metres, perhaps try the YouTube stream, and there I think the audio quality should be fairly close to impeccable. And I know that also we have quite a few viewers on that audio stream most weeks, interstate and overseas. Anyway, reverting to Douglas Self. Why do I mention him so often? Well, Douglas Self is an audio engineer, and I'm not talking somebody who appoints those titles to himself. He is well qualified. Douglas Self occupies a position in audio engineering authorship today that's paralleled by the reputations of John Lindsley Hood or Ben Dawson. They're all formally qualified in science and engineering, immune to the mythology of bogus audio marketing, and there's an awful lot of that. Douglas Self has the reputation today of being the equivalent of what G.A. Briggs was in the 1950s. He's at the forefront of acoustic theory and measurement, and not afraid to smash commonly held misconceptions, especially those associated with the expensive marketing of bogus audio improvements, put that in inverted commas, which exploit a marketplace that's rife with gullible engineering ignorance. Douglas Self is a British electronics engineer and author with a particular interest in audio. He received a first-class honours degree in engineering from Cambridge University and then studied psychoacoustics at Sussex University. He's the author of 6 books on audio electronics published by Focal Press. He's also contributed many articles to the prestigious Wireless World magazine in the past, some of which were compiled into a book along with articles by Peter Baxendall of the well-known Baxendall tone control system fame. Douglas Self has worked with several major companies including Cambridge Audio, TAG McLaren Audio and Soundcraft Electronics. Circuit Seller website describes him as a renowned audio specialist when discussing a design he created for Elector magazine. He developed the concept of a blameless amplifier in which all the main sources of distortion are reduced to negligible levels. Self's books have been well received. His Audio Power Amplifier Design Handbook was recommended by Walt Jung and described as famous by the audio website Hi-Fi Sonics. The second edition of his small signal audio design received a very positive review in Sound on Sound magazine. I read some of Douglas Self's articles about science versus subjectivism in audio in previous weeks. That is, measurement versus opinion. And this is an area which affects audio particularly because audio marketing has gone very haywire with outrageous claims, particularly over the last 40 years or so. Let's look into the articles of faith in the tenets of subjectivism. All of the alleged effects that I'm about to list have received considerable affirmation in the audio press, to the point where some are treated as facts. The reality is that none of them has in the last 30 years proved susceptible to objective confirmation. This sad record of outrageous claim is perhaps equalled only by students of parapsychology. I hope that the brief statements that I'm about to make are considered fair by their proponents. If not, I've no doubt that I shall soon hear about it. Claim 1. Sine waves are steady-state signals that represent too easy a test for amplifiers compared with the complexities of music. Unquote. This claim is presumably meant to imply that sine waves are in some way particularly easy for an amplifier to deal with. The implication being that anyone using a total harmonic distortion analyzer must be hopelessly naive. Since sines and cosines have an unending series of non-zero differentials, steady hardly comes into it. I know of no evidence that sine waves of randomly varying amplitude, for example, would provide a more searching test of amplifier competence. I believe this outlook is the result of anthropomorphic thinking about amplifiers, treating them as though they think about what they amplify. 20 sine waves of different frequencies may be conceptually complex to us, and the output of a symphony orchestra much more so. But to an amplifier, both composite signals resolve to a single instantaneous voltage that must be increased in amplitude and presented at low impedance. The rate of change of this voltage has a maximum set by the frequency response and amplitude capability of the channel, and is not generally greater for more complex signals. You don't get a higher slew rate with bigger orchestras. You must remember that an amplifier has no perspective on the signal arriving at its input, but literally takes it as it comes. Audio claim 2, quote, capacitors affect the signal passing through them in a way invisible to distortion measurements, unquote. Several writers have advocated passing pulse signals through two different sorts of capacitor and subtracting the result, claiming that the non-zero residue proves that capacitors can introduce audible errors. In fact, such tests expose only well-known capacitor shortcomings such as dielectric absorption and series resistance, and perhaps the vulnerability of the dielectric film in electrolytics to reverse biasing. No one has yet shown how these imperfections could cause capacitor audibility in a properly designed equipment. Audio claim 3, quote, passing an audio signal through cables, PCB tracks, or switch contacts causes a cumulative deterioration. Precious metal contact surfaces reduce but do not eliminate the problem. This too is undetectable by tests for nonlinearity, unquote. Concern over audio cables is widespread, but it can be said with confidence that there is as yet not a shred of evidence to support it. Any piece of wire passes a sine wave with unmeasurable distortion, and so simple notions of intercrystal rectification or microdiodes can be discounted, quite apart from the fact that such behaviour is absolutely ruled out by the established materials science at the present. No plausible means of detecting, let alone measuring, cable degradation has ever been proposed. The most significant parameter of a loudspeaker cable is probably its lumped inductance. This can cause minor variations in frequency response at the very top of the audio band, given a demanding load impedance. These deviations are unlikely to exceed 0.1 dB for reasonable cable constructions, for example, inductance less than 4 microhenries. The resistance of a typical cable, perhaps 0.1 ohm, causes response variations across the band following the speaker impedance curve, but these are usually even smaller at around 0.05 dB. This just is not audible. Corrosion is often blamed for subtle signal degradation at switch and connector contacts. By far the most common form of contact degradation is the formation of an insulating sulfide layer on silver contacts, derived from hydrogen sulfide air pollution. The problem seems to have become worse in recent years. This typically cuts the signal altogether, except when the signal peaks temporarily punch through the sulfide layer. The effect is gross and completely inapplicable to theories of subtle degradation. Gold plating is the only certain cure. It costs money. A switch with gold-flashed contacts can cost 5 times as much as the silver version. Audio Claim 4. Quote, "Cables are directional and pass audio better in one direction than the other." Unquote. Audio signals are AC cables and cannot be directional any more than 2 plus 2 can equal 5. Anyone prepared to believe this nonsense won't be capable of designing amplifiers, so there seems no point in further comment. Audio Claim 5. Quote, and this is an interesting one, "The sound of valves is inherently superior to that of any kind of semiconductor." Unquote. This valve sound is one phenomenon that may have a real existence. It's been known for a long time that listeners sometimes prefer to have a certain amount of second harmonic distortion added in, and most valve amplifiers provide just that, due to grave difficulties in providing good linearity with modest feedback factors. While this may well sound nice, hi-fi is supposedly about accuracy, and if the sound is to be thus modified, it should be controllable from the front panel by a, quote, niceness knob. The use of valves leads to some intractable problems of linearity, reliability, and the need for intimidatingly expensive, and once more, non-linear, iron cord audio transformers. The current fashion is for exposed valves, and it's not at all clear to me that a fragile glass bottle containing a red-hot anode with hundreds of volts DC on it is wholly satisfactory for domestic safety. A recent development in subjectivism is enthusiasm for single-ended directly heated triodes, usually in extremely expensive monoblock systems. Such an amplifier generates large amounts of second harmonic distortion due to the asymmetry of single-ended operation, and requires a very large output transformer, as its primary has to carry the full DC anode current of the output valve, and core saturation must be avoided. Power outputs are inevitably very limited at 10 watts or less. In a recent review, the Carey CAD 300 SEI triode amplifier yielded 3% total harmonic distortion at 9 watts, wait for it, at a cost of $3,400. I don't think I need comment further on that. Audio Claim 6. Quote, negative feedback is inherently a bad thing. The less it's used, the better the amplifier sounds without qualification. Unquote. Negative feedback is not inherently a bad thing. It's an absolutely indispensable principle of electronic design, and if used properly has the remarkable ability to make just about every parameter better. It's usually global feedback that the critic has in mind. Local negative feedback is grudgingly regarded as acceptable, probably because making a circuit with no feedback of any kind is near impossible. It's often said that high levels of negative feedback enforce a low slew rate. This is quite untrue, and this thorny issue is dealt with in another section of my paper. Claim 7. Quote, tone controls cause an audible deterioration even when set to the flat position. Unquote. This is usually blamed on phase shift. At the time of writing, tone controls on a preamp badly damaged its chances of street, or rather sitting room, credibility for no good reason. Tone controls set to flat cannot possibly contribute any extra phase shift and must be inaudible. My view is that they are absolutely indispensable for correcting room acoustics, loudspeakers, room acoustics, or shortcomings of the room itself, or tonal balance of the source material, and that a lot of people are suffering suboptimal sound as a result of this no tone control fashion. It's now commonplace for audio critics to suggest that frequency response inadequacies should be corrected by changing loudspeakers. This is an extraordinarily expensive way of avoiding tone controls. Audio Claim 8. Quote, the design of the power supply has subtle effects on the sound, quite apart from the ordinary dangers like ripple injection. Unquote. All good amplifier stages ignore imperfections in their power supplies, op-amps in particular, excelling at power supply rejection ratio. More nonsense has been written on the subject of subtle power supply failings than on most audio topics. Recommendations of hardwiring the mains or using gold-plated 13-amp plugs would seem to hold no residual shred of rationality in view of the usual processes of rectification and regulation that the raw AC undergoes. And where do you stop? At the local substation? Should we gold plate the pylons all the way to the Latrobe Valley? Audio Claim 9. Monoblock construction, that is, two separate power amplifier boxes for each audio channel of a stereo pair, is always audibly superior due to reduction in crosstalk. Unquote. There is absolutely no need to go to the expense of monoblock power amplifiers in order to keep crosstalk under control, even when making it substantially better than the minus 20 dB that is actually necessary. The techniques are conventional. The last stereo power amplifier that I, Douglas Self, designed easily managed minus 90 dB at 10 kHz without anything other than the usual precautions on the circuit board. In this area, dedicated followers of fashion pay dearly for the privilege, as the cost of the mechanical parts in a monoblock system will be nearly doubled. Audio claim 10. Quote, microphony is an important factor in the sound of an amplifier, so any attempt at vibration damping is a good idea, unquote. Microphony is essentially something that happens in sensitive valve preamplifiers. If it happens in solid-state power amplifiers, the level is so far below the noise it is effectively non-existent. Experiments on this sort of thing are rare, if not unheard of, so I offer only a scrap of evidence that I have. Take a microphone preamp operating at a gain of plus 70 dB and tap the input capacitors, assumed electrolytic, sharply with a screwdriver. The preamp output will be a dull thump at very low level. The physical impact on the electrolytics, the only components that show this effect, is hugely greater than that of any acoustic vibration, and I think the effect in power amps, if any, must be so vanishingly small that it could never be found under the inherent circuit noise. In summary, let's for a moment assume that some or all of the above hypotheses that I've just read are true, and explore the implications. The effects are not detectable by conventional measurement, but are assumed to be audible. Firstly, it can presumably be taken as axiomatic that for each audible defect some change occurs in the pattern of pressure fluctuations reaching the ears, and therefore a corresponding modification has occurred to the electrical signal passing through the amplifier. Any other starting point supposes that there is some other route conveying the information apart from the electrical signals, and we're faced with magic or forces unknown to science. Mercifully, no commentator has so far suggested this. Hence, there must be defects in the audio signals, but they are not revealed by the usual test methods. That's what they think in the audiophile area sometimes. How could this situation exist? There seem to be two possible explanations for this failure of detection. One is that the standard measurements are relevant but of insufficient resolution, and we should be measuring frequency response, etc., to the thousandths of a dB. There is no evidence whatsoever that such micro deviations are audible under any circumstances. Well, that's an extract from a paper called Science versus Subjectivism by Douglas Self. This is VK3 Alpha Mike Lima with the usual Saturday night transmission on 147.475. Also, via YouTube Live on VK3AML 17 July 2021. That is, if you want to look in or listen in on this transmission. Again, Google the phrase VK3AML 17 July 2021, and that should take you to our YouTube live stream. This is VK3AML. And in case you were wondering, that was actually pre-recorded. I hope none of the usual echo effects were coming through on that. It's now 10:13 p.m. Leading on from that, in the last decade or so, there was an Audio Engineering Society, AES, conference on unfounded audio claims of the audio industry. And if I am lucky, I should be able to find you that talk by Ethan Weiner, who is a musician as well as an audio engineer, qualified audio engineer, and he took up the subject at an Audio Engineers Society conference, as I say, which is what you're about to hear. This is an extract from his talk. I think you'll find some of this quite hilarious.
The result is endless arguments over basic scientific principles that have been understood fully for more than 50 years. The value of ultra-high sample rates and bit depth, the importance of dither and clock jitter, and even believing that replacement AC power cables can affect the sound passing through the connected devices. An entire industry has emerged to sell placebo tweaks to an unsuspecting public, in my opinion, of course. So let's look at some of the more outrageous examples. And I have some pretty funny ones here.
Oh boy.
All right. This is, and I don't know how clear it is out there, but I think it's obvious that this is a jar of rocks.
Oh boy. It's the Brilliant Pebbles.
Right. This is a real product. This is actually sold. I don't know how many they sell, but it's a real product, and you can pay $130 for these. And here's a typical application. You can take them out and scotch tape them to your RCA cables. And I don't know if you can, I hope the text is readable, but this was taken right off their website. And, it's typical of hi-fi audiophile kind of silly prose. And this is a different company. And it's the clip on the right, which I don't know if you can see, but it's really a crappy soldering job. And again, this is real products. Personally, I hope that this is just, he's playing a joke on the audio industry, but I know at least a few people buy this
Peter
stuff.
Belt is absolutely sincere.
Is he really?
I don't know about some of the others. Peter Belt is absolutely sincere. He believes it. But he absolutely believes it.
But why does he charge £500, which is like $1,000, for a stupid alligator? But people believe it, and you go to the audiophile forums where JJ and I, I don't even post a stereophile anymore, but there will be people that maybe haven't bought it, but say, well, you don't know it can't work. How can you be sure it's not going to work? I said, well, I know a little about electronics and a little bit about the frailty of hearing and why people might think it works, and these people will argue to the death that it might work, and you can't prove it doesn't. Well, okay, you're right, I can't. Maybe these guys are playing a joke, maybe they're not, but the products are real. These guys are dead serious. And there was a huge, 20-odd page argument at Stereophile web forum about this one that finally the moderator shut down. He should have shut it down the first day. This art is right off their website. For size comparison, those things are about the size of a golf ball. And this is $3,000 for that. And they look really cool. I mean, I should take a cue and maybe make some of my acoustic treatment products look like that, except, of course, it would be, really big. Well, then there's the Marigot dots that are literally those little, half-inch diameter paper things that you stick on to color to tell your kid that you did good, And they say stick them on the windows. And they're not a lot of money. They're $20, $30. It's an impulse purchase. The hi-fi people say, it's cheap enough. Might as well try it. And they sell a lot of these things for $20 that you could buy at, Office Max for 40 cents. So this I took out of Pro Audio Review because it really, I expect to see this stuff in the audiophile press, but I really felt a little offended, I guess, to see this. And I was kind of upset when I saw they had a booth upstairs. If you guys are here, I'm sorry, but no, I'm not. And, it's only $130, which is not like really stupid. But it's a power cord. It's a power cord. Let me say it again. It's a power cord. Audio doesn't go through it, and it's connected to 400 feet of other power cord that's Romex. It's in your walls. This is an LP and CD demagnetizer. And, think about that for a minute. And it's $1,800. I used to have a tape eraser for little ones. I used to have a professional one that in like the 1970s cost a couple $100 for demagnetizing a 2-inch reel of tape. But that was like $200, maybe $400 today if it's really good. But I mean, this is stupid.
How do companies convince otherwise sane people to pay $129 for a jar of rocks? Or $3,000 for magic bowls way too small to possibly affect acoustics? Or thousands of dollars for a replacement power cable? There are even audiophile-grade USB cables costing hundreds of dollars. More important, why do people think they hear a difference? Always an improvement, of course, with such products. Through my research in room acoustics, I believe the acoustic phenomenon known as comb filtering is one plausible explanation for many of the differences people claim to hear from cables, power conditioners, mechanical isolation devices, low jitter external clocks, ultra-high sample rates, replacement power cords and fuses, and so forth. Comb filtering is a specific type of frequency response error that occurs when direct sound from the loudspeakers combines in the air with reflections off the walls, floor, ceiling, and other nearby objects. This graph shows the response I measured 18 inches away from a reflecting sheetrock wall. In this graph and the previous one, you can see the repeating pattern of equally spaced peaks and deep nulls. The peak and null frequencies are related to the delay time, which in turn is related to the distance of the reflecting surfaces. This particular graph compares the response measured with and without absorption at the sidewall reflection points in my living room. Peaks and deep nulls occur at predictable quarter wavelength distances, and at higher frequencies it takes very little distance to go from a peak to a null. For example, at 7 kHz, a quarter wavelength is less than half an inch. At these higher frequencies, reflections from a nearby coffee table or even a leather seat back can make a big change in the frequency response at your ears. Because of comb filtering due to multiple reflections in a room, moving even a tiny distance changes the response a lot, especially in small rooms having no acoustic treatment. The response at any given cubic inch location in a room is the sum of the direct sound from the speakers, plus many competing reflections all arriving from different directions. This graph shows the frequency response for two locations in the same room only 4 inches apart, yet it looks like different speakers in a totally different room. Keeping what truly matters in perspective, it makes little sense to obsess over microscopic amounts of distortion in an A to D converter when most loudspeakers have at least 10 times more distortion. This graph shows the first 5 individual components measured from a loudspeaker playing a 50 Hz tone. When you add them up, the total THD is 6.14%, and this doesn't include the IM products we'd also have if there were 2 or more source frequencies. Likewise, compared to even very modest gear, all domestic-sized rooms have huge variations in low-frequency response, comb filtering from untreated reflections, and substantial ringing at a dozen or more modal frequencies. This graph shows the low-frequency response at high resolution as measured in a bedroom-sized space. Does it make sense to obsess over gear when listening environments are by comparison so much worse? As audio professionals, we should strive for the highest quality possible. Of course, but it's important to keep things in perspective and be practical. My intent is not to belabor the importance of acoustics, but to put in perspective what parts of a playback system do the most damage. Most sensible people will aim to improve the weakest link first. There's also anti-science bias by those who believe specs don't matter and science doesn't know how to measure what they are certain they can hear. If it weren't for science, we'd all be banging on tree stumps in a dark cave. As JJ explained, every time you play a recording it sounds a little different. Further, if you move your head even an inch or two, the frequency response can change substantially due to acoustic comb filtering, especially in an untreated room. And the more you hear a piece of music, the more likely you'll notice details previously missed. Is that triangle hit clearer because you recently added a power conditioner, or simply because you never noticed it playing before? Understanding that test gear is far more reliable and repeatable than human hearing is the last frontier in stamping out audio myths. Ultimately, these are consumerist issues, and I accept that people have a right to spend their money however they choose. I'm not opposed to paying more for real value. Parts and build quality, features, reliability, and even appearance cost more. For example, some DI boxes cost $30 and others cost 10 times more. If I'm an engineer at Universal Studios recording movie scores, which can cost hundreds of dollars per minute just for the musicians, I will not buy cheap junk that might break at the worst time. My only aim here is to explain what affects audio fidelity, to what degree of audibility, and why. The following 4 parameters define everything needed to assess high-quality audio reproduction: frequency response, distortion, noise, time-based errors. There are subsets of these parameters. For example, under distortion, there's harmonic distortion, IM distortion or intermodulation distortion, and digital aliasing. Noise encompasses tape hiss, hum and buzz, vinyl crackles, and cable handling noise known as the triboelectric effect. Time-based errors are wow and flutter from vinyl records and tape respectively, and jitter in digital systems. Aside from devices that intentionally add color by changing the frequency response or adding distortion, it's generally accepted that audio gear should aim to be transparent. This is easily tested by measuring the above 4 parameters with various test signals. If the frequency response is flat to less than 1/10 dB from 20 Hz to 20 kHz, and the sum of all noise and distortion is at least 100 dB below the music, a device can be said to be audibly transparent. A device that's transparent will sound the same as every other transparent device, whether a microphone preamp or DAW summing algorithm. Of course, transparency is not the only goal of audio gear. Euphonic distortion can be useful as glue, but there's no need for magic. Transformers can add distortion, tubes can add distortion, tape distorts if you record at high levels, but do we really need to spend thousands of dollars on boutique gear to get these effects? Are there other more practical and affordable ways to get the same or similar results? Regardless, it's impossible to argue about the subjective value of gear color, so I won't even try. Although product specs can indeed tell us everything we need to know, many specs are incomplete, misleading, and sometimes even fraudulent. But this doesn't mean specs cannot tell us everything that's needed to assess transparency. We just need all of the data. Common techniques to mislead include using third octave averaging for microphone and loudspeaker response, and specifying a frequency response with no plus or minus dB range, or using very large divisions like 10 or 20 dB each to make a ragged response look more flat. I measured this loudspeaker from about a foot away in a fairly large room. This graph shows the true responses measured, with no averaging. This graph shows the exact same data, but with third octave averaging applied. This graph shows the same average data again, but at 20 dB per vertical division to make the loudspeaker look flatter than it really is. Which version looks more like what speaker makers publish? Masking is a well-known principle by which a loud sound can hide a softer sound if both sounds have similar frequencies. This means you can hear treble-heavy tape hiss more readily during a bass solo than during a drum solo. Cymbals and violins contain a lot of treble, so that tends to hide hiss. The masking effect makes it difficult to hear artifacts even 40 dB below the music, yet some people are convinced they can hear artifacts such as jitter 100 dB down or lower. Compare that to test gear that can reliably measure down to the noise floor and gives identical results every time. Another factor is that our ears are most sensitive to frequencies in the treble range around 2 to 4 kHz, so distortion that lies mostly in that range is more noticeable and more objectionable than artifacts at lower frequencies. Intermodulation distortion typically contains both low and high frequencies, depending on the frequencies present in the music. Some IM components are not related musically to the fundamental pitches, so IM distortion is usually more objectionable and dissonant sounding than harmonic distortion. In a moment, I'll play a DAW project that lets us hear the relative audibility of artifacts at different levels below the music. With subjective listening tests versus measuring, it's mandatory to change only the one thing being tested. For example, recording different performances to compare microphones or preamps is not valid because the performances can vary. The same subtle details we listen for when comparing gear change from one performance to another. For example, a bell-like attack of a guitar note or a certain sheen on a brushed cymbal. Nobody can play or sing exactly the same way twice or remain perfectly stationary, so that's not a valid way to test preamps or anything else. Even if you could sing or play the same, a change in microphone position of even 1/4 inch is enough to make a real difference in the frequency response the microphone captures. Likewise, when the differences are subtle, non-blind or sighted tests are invalid because, as JJ explained, we tend to hear what we want to hear or think we should hear. This goes by many names: confirmation bias, placebo effect, buyer's remorse, and expectation bias. It's been said that audiophile reviewers can always identify which amplifier they're hearing as long as they can read the nameplate. If you record a rock band one day with preamp brand A and a jazz trio the next day with brand B, it's impossible to assess anything meaningful about the preamps. One valid way to compare different preamps is to split the output of one microphone and record each preamp to a separate track for comparative playback later. However, a splitter transformer can affect interaction between the microphone and preamp. So a better way is with reamping, where you record the same playback through a loudspeaker of a single performance. Yes, the sound from the speaker may not be the same as a live cymbal or piano in the room, but that doesn't matter. The loudspeaker simply becomes the new live source, and any difference in tonality between the preamps being tested is still revealed. Another self-testing method is called ABX. There are freeware software programs that play wave files at random, which you try to identify. But you must repeat a test enough times to get a conclusive answer. If you happen to guess right one time, that proves nothing. You'd have the same chance flipping a coin. Now, if you can get it right 10 times out of 10, that's much more significant. One big feature of ABX testing is you can do it in the comfort of your own home, whenever you want. You can even test yourself over many months if you like. This avoids any chance of being stressed while you listen, which some people claim makes blind testing unreliable. Indeed, double-blind tests are the gold standard in every field of science. It amazes me when some people claim that double-blind testing is not valid for assessing audio gear. Besides changing only one thing at a time, matching the A and B volume levels is also important. When comparing two identical sources, the louder one often sounds better, unless it's already too loud. This is mostly due to the Fletcher-Munson effect bringing out more clarity and fullness at higher volume levels. I can demonstrate a lot of things here in this video, but with lossy audio it may not be possible to hear more subtle details. So I've explained how proper tests are conducted and encourage you to try your own tests at home in your own familiar environment. People talk about stacking preamps and A to D converters in the sense that using the same preamp or converter for multiple tracks affects the result mix more than one preamp on one track does. Here, stacking means the preamps are used in parallel. Any coloration present in the preamp will be repeated for all of the tracks. So when all of the tracks are mixed together, the result contains that coloration. So far so good. If the preamp used for each track has 4 dB of boost around 1 kHz, that's the same as using a flat preamp and adding an equalizer with 4 dB of boost on the mix bus. However, no competent preamp has a response nearly that skewed. Even modest gear is flat within 1 dB from 20 Hz to 20 kHz, but if a preamp does have a frequency response coloration, whether pleasing or not, it can be compensated for with mix bus EQ as just explained. It's not like mixing 20 tracks needs 20 times as much EQ to compensate. Now let's consider distortion and noise, the other two parameters that affect the sound of a preamp or converter. Artifacts and other coloration from gear used in parallel does not add the same as when devices are connected in series. In a little while you'll hear a mix that was sent through multiple A to D conversions in series to more easily hear the degradation. But this is not the same as stacking in parallel. In series is far more damaging. This brings us to coherence. Noise and distortion on separate tracks do not add coherently. If you record the same mono guitar part on two analog tape tracks at once, when played back, the signals combine to give 6 dB more output. But the tape noise is different on each track and so rises only 3 dB. This is the same as using a tape track that's twice as wide, or the difference between 8 tracks on half-inch tape versus 8 tracks on 1-inch tape. Likewise for distortion. The distortion added by a preamp or converter on a bass track has different content than the distortion added to a vocal track. So when you combine them in a mix, the relative distortion for each track remains the same. Thus, there is no stacking accumulation for distortion either. If you record a DI bass track through a preamp having 1% distortion on one track, then record a grand piano through the same preamp, the mixed result will have the same 1% distortion on each instrument. Finally, subjective terms such as warm, cold, sterile, forward, and silky, and so forth, are not useful because they don't mean the same thing to everyone, versus 3 dB down at 200 Hz, which is precise and leaves no room for interpretation. Of course, warm and cold or sterile could describe the relative amount of high-frequency content, so saying subdued or exaggerated highs is better than sterile in my opinion. Sometimes people refer to a piece of gear as being musical sounding or resolving, but what does that really mean? What sounds musical to you may not sound musical to me. Some people like the added bass you get from an old-style receiver's loudness switch. To me that usually sounds tubby, unless the music you're playing sounds thin. Same for a slight treble boost to add sheen, or a slight treble cut to reduce harshness. It's highly dependent on the particular music playing, and highly dependent on personal preference. I don't think we need yet more adjectives to describe audio fidelity when we already have perfectly good ones. The audiophile terms pace, rhythm, and timing take this absurdity to new heights because those words already have a specific musical meaning unrelated to whatever audiophiles think they are conveying. Then its track volume indicates.
And that item was from an Audio Engineering Society lecture about 10 years ago. This is VK3 Alpha Mike Lima on 147.475. At about 11 o'clock we'll be taking I suppose you'd call it a callback, but I prefer to call it the opening of a QSO on 147.475, and I'm also watching our chat box beside the YouTube live stream from time to time, so if anybody wants to make a comment there, feel very free. I note we've got John Young, Matt Bird, VK3ZGC, Dennis, the YouTube watcher, Terry Sims, 3FJ. Here we are. Matt says, great work on the OBS juggling. Well, it is juggling at the moment. I don't quite know what I'm doing with it, but we'll get there. But thank you to there are now 12 people watching on YouTube Live. And you'll note that the live camera is a little bit less puce in reproducing my skin tones than the previous adjustments were. I found that the saturation was wound flat out on the webcam, so I was starting to look like I was about to die of a heart attack, or something was wrong with my nose in an alcoholic sense. The next item I've got is of a chap who's just recently written a book on Dr. Lee DeForest, who is the inventor of the triode valve and later on was prominent in the development of optical soundtrack talking pictures in the early 1920s. Mike Adams has done extensive research on DeForest, interviewing over a period of 50 or 60 years quite a few of DeForest's contemporaries and family members, many of whom are now deceased. So what he has to say has reasonable personal insight on the man. DeForest was a bit of an egomaniac, unfortunately tended to be very jealous of credit, so alienated a number of people that he worked with during his lifetime, including Theodore Case, who was the chap who originally worked with him on the development of optical sound. Case was particularly offended by the way DeForest took credit for taking the first newsreel of the American president, Calvin Coolidge, and there was a split. Eventually, Case, developing his own system as Fox Movietone, sold his idea to William Fox, and that's how the first Fox pictures were done with optical sound. DeForest didn't manage to sell his sound system to anyone, although he made hundreds of theatrical short films with sound to demonstrate his system, many of which survive. I think over the top of this Mike Adams item, what I might do is to run some video that I took last week, which may be of background interest, from the top of the Langham Hotel in the city. I just took a good 4K camera with a good long lens, 26 times optical zoom, and panned it around, particularly at night, taking photos of this and that. Then I went out on the town in the evening with my wife Prue and took a lot of video with this little camera stuck on a tripod. And this one, although it's a point and shoot, it's a top end point and shoot and has fairly good results at night. So we got a lot of video of Melbourne at night. So you'll see as wallpaper, if you're on the YouTube live stream, the view from the Langham Hotel while we're listening to the talk on Dr. Lee DeForest. I'll just see, there we go. And the people on the YouTube live stream should now be seeing at night the view directly across Yarra River of Flinders Street Station at about, 6:15 p.m. This is about 8 days ago, before the dreaded lockdown. So while that's running on video, Mike Adams presents Dr. Lee DeForest, the subject of his biographical book.
I'm Mike Adams. I know this has been up here a long time. This is what I'm going to try to cover today. I wrote the book, and it's a giant, really thick book. It'll keep you occupied for weeks and weeks. What I want to talk about today, and I've titled this "The Local Lee," because something that Lee DeForest did that was the most significant thing of his entire career that made everything happen, he did it in Palo Alto at one of the first Silicon Valley startups. And that is that he made his Audion tube into an amplifier of audio, and thus radio broadcasting for audiences and also sound film. So I want to emphasize the local Lee DeForest, but because I wrote this book and because I teach students how to do research and how to think about subjects like this, I want to also do something for you that my students are always encouraged to do too, and that's to kind of use multimedia. In other words, I wrote a book, which is Springer Science. They dated it 2012, but it came out in last December. But I also have had the LeeDeForest.org website, and I've had that since since the 80s, when I was on the Preamps Foundation and we had the DeForest papers. This was in Foothill College, mind you, in the late 80s. I took out the LeeDeForest.org website, and I've been doing it ever since. And it's the main website. If you type in Lee DeForest into your browser, you will get that, which will give you a link to the Facebook page. I also created a Facebook page for DeForest, and I did that because I have a lot of little movies, sound movies. One of DeForest's claim to fame, he did these little movies. I also have some visuals, and I put those on the Facebook. So it's something you can't get in just a book. So what I've tried to do is give people kind of the multimedia. I call it the author's work. When I'm Wrong one. Oh, there we go. When I'm working with research, which is something I really like to do, the main question that you always have to ask is, how do you know what you know, right? And it's very important. And this is what separates an educated approach from one that's, well, somebody told me that and I believe it, but the question is, how do you know what you know? And so there are 3 archives that I went to for primary information on Lee DeForest when I was writing this book. The largest collection is in San Jose, and I'll tell you the most fascinating thing about the San Jose collection, which is in History San Jose, are DeForest school books from his time at Yale University from in the late 1890s. DeForest was BA and PhD Yale, and we actually have his book. So you can see what he was thinking sitting there in class. You can see what he was learning. He was learning about Hertz and Maxwell and all the famous theoreticians and inventors of the day through his professors at Yale. And then we have some later things here from the teens where he's experimenting and doing drawings. But there's a lot of stuff, including diaries. So there's plenty of DeForest stuff. The Case Museum gives perspective to the DeForest story because DeForest worked with Theodore Case, an inventor that worked with DeForest on the film project during the decade of the 1920s. And as you know, DeForest collected and saved everything possible, but it's all favorable to DeForest, as we all. We're the gatekeepers of our own story, right? But if you go to the Case Museum, you get actual letters that are nowhere else that DeForest and Case exchanged about sound on film. And there, it gives you a fascinating glimpse into a story which I tell in about 4 chapters of this book. There's also technology that is nowhere else. The adapter for playing back sound films on a silent projector, DeForest phonofilms. And you can see this little wire-wound rheostat. If you look right there, it's DeForest in script letters, like he actually... somebody who made this by hand, right? So interesting stuff. There are also photographs as well. And then the third collection, which most people don't know about, is at the Los Angeles County Museum of Natural History, the so-called Seaver Center on Western History. There, not only was I able to get a perspective on other film inventors and a history of film, but also there is a phonofilm scrapbook, something that should have been in the San Jose collection. It used the same format, the same scrapbook format, filled with pictures and letters and things like that. It is at the Seaver Center. Also some photographs and other things. So this is how, when someone asks the question, well, how do you know what you know? Well, I know from looking in these 3 archives. I know from examining all the patents, and I also know from examining what some people call the first draft of history. That is the newspaper stories that were written between the beginning of the 20th century and 1950s when DeForest was finishing out his life. Quick biography about DeForest. He was born in Iowa, raised in Alabama. He received his PhD from the Yale University Sheffield Scientific School. This was in 1899. Here's what he wrote in his diary when he graduated from Yale. He said, "My specialty then shall be the condenser." So he was his doctoral work was on Heinrich Hertz, reflections of waves on parallel wires or something. We have it in San Jose. We have his actual work from his doctoral thesis. Here's what I found to be the most important thing from the collection from Yale. And this was from an 1897 notebook where he was sitting in class. He drew this diagram, and you can see it's a microphone and a battery, an inductance, a transformer, right? And the secondary of the transformer modulates an arc lamp and in series with a DC source. And he says, talking arc, like speaking flame, it gives a fine reproduction of any sound at the microphone and vice versa. And this I call his talisman. This, when I saw this, I said, oh my gosh, this is what DeForest did every time he invented. He went to the flame, right? His flame detector, which didn't work, but it inspired his vacuum tube audion. His arc transmitter, the early radio transmitter, was an arc, right? His flame microphone, which he invented, dangerous thing, you know, flames, right? Gas flames. Flame microphone in the 1920s. His sound on film process, his very first way of writing with light on film was an arc. And his flat panel television, which used a bunch of flames. This he talked about in the 1950s, but never really went any farther. But, you know, there's a lot of detail on that, which I will obviously not go into, but it is in the book. Okay. DeForest was fortunate that he had 3 good decades as an inventor. Most of us, you look at artists, at creative people, at scientists, you know, we might have 10 good years where we're really cranking out the hits, and then all of a sudden we're just okay, right? I mean, all of us have that. You know, maybe as a writer, maybe I have just a few good years in there where things were going just right. DeForest had 3 good decades. His first decade, he immediately upon college graduation improved upon Marconi's wireless, and he was popular in wireless and sold wireless equipment for one very good reason I talk about in the book. Whenever they referred to him, they always said, you know, our equipment is from the American DeForest. So there was this thing about, you know, well, Marconi, he's not American, you know, he's from the UK, and so we ought to give our business to DeForest. And of course, many people did, even though he got in trouble for stock fraud. Abraham White, you've all heard of. The entire story is in the book. Between 1907 and 1920, he worked on the 3-element vacuum tube broadcasting music, also using arc and vacuum tube transmitters. And then his final good decade, the decade of the 20s, he tends to call it his lost decade because he did not succeed. He did develop a system and patent it for writing a soundtrack optically on motion picture film. It did work, but it ended up in court like a lot of inventor things, and it did not work. One of the main things I want to emphasize about DeForest is he took the science of the 19th century because he was a scholar. He knew about all the literature. He knew about what other scientists were doing. He had all the patents, as all inventors did back then. Try to figure out a way of doing things just different enough to get a patent and maybe make a profit. But he turned that 19th century science, the theory and experiments of many, into an art form, several art forms in the 20th century, the electronic media of radio, film, and then television. And my publisher titled the book, you know, I was going to call it Lee DeForest and the Invention of Sound on Film or something linear and kind of, you know, stodgy, but Springer came up with the cover, which is really very good, based on a photograph I gave them of the DeForest star in Hollywood, and they came up with the title. And when I first heard it, I thought, oh, well, is that a little over the top? People will say, no, he wasn't the king. No, he wasn't the king of television. But I like it. So it's catchy. It's catchy, and so it stayed that way. But he did do this, and he did this mostly, again, I emphasize, his most important contribution was the amplification that he managed to discover with the vacuum tube, because this allowed audiences. You know, in 1920, hams with earphones, that was radio. Well, amplification was going to change that and put it into loudspeakers, and families were going to enjoy radio. Same thing with film. The silent film was okay, but, and some of the earlier experiments in silent film used earphones, actually, but DeForest really, we can say, gave voice to the radio and to the motion picture, if anything else. I want to talk a little bit about how the inventor invents, and I want to use the example of the vacuum tube. I don't know how often I've gone to conferences and people have said, oh yeah, DeForest vacuum tube, he stole it from Fleming. Well, it's not that clear cut, and let me explain why. And this is, again, based on what I know, my research. First of all, let's go back to Edison in 1880, who actually invented the light bulb, and he noticed that as the bulbs burned, week after week, there would be a black carbon deposit from the filament on the inside of the bulb, which of course would make the light get dimmer and dimmer, and this was not good, right? So Edison looked at this and he said, well, you know, I think electrons go from, in his case, from the filament to a plate. He put a plate inside the bulb to draw off the electrons. He didn't really know why, but it did, and thus the bulb would not necessarily carbon up, and but he used the plate. He used it as a measurement of current flow.
And I'll interrupt Mike Adams there to say this is VK3AML on 147.475 and on live stream YouTube. If you care to dial up YouTube, VK3AML 17 July 2021, you will get me. Put that into Google search. VK3AML 17 July 2021 will find our YouTube live stream, which if you're having trouble with our audio on 2 meters, that might be the best option. At 11 o'clock, in 9 minutes' time, I'll be opening up for effectively a callback, hopefully a QSO with people. So if you could be ready to have a chat, I'd be most interested to chat until midnight, at least, and we'll take it up from there. So I'll be going live on 147.475 and streaming to YouTube Live at 11 p.m., 9 minutes' time.
It was a beginning, early theory of thermionic emission. Well, he put it aside. He patented it. He called it the Edison effect. He put it aside. Well, here's Ambrose Fleming. Fleming worked for Edison. Fleming was in the UK, running Edison in the UK, and then he went to work for Marconi at the beginning of the century. And so Fleming's interest, because he had to work for a living, he had to do what Marconi said. And Marconi was in the business of Morse code, two-way communication, nothing else. He didn't want radio or audio or music. He wanted code. And so Fleming got a patent for a diode vacuum tube, a rectifier, but using it as a detector of wireless signals. He got this in 1905. Now, Fleming's tube, and you can see the little red square there, when it detects the presence of a dot or a dash, it makes a meter called a galvanometer move from one part to the other. I've not really seen one. I know we have a galvanometer up here somewhere, but this is what Fleming's thing did, because Fleming worked for Marconi, and this was a detector of Morse code, the on or off of the dots and dashes. Well, Fleming could not go much farther, and he might have. You know, we can always say, well, maybe Edison would have invented the vacuum tube. Maybe Fleming would have if he hadn't had to work for a guy that only cared about Morse code. Well, DeForest came along, and I have a letter in the book quoting DeForest. He writes to his attorney and says, you know, get me that Fleming patent, because DeForest wanted to look at it carefully. Well, what he did a year later, and he also did this for wireless telegraph, because he had not yet started the process of working on voice transmission, radio telephone. What DeForest did was take the same Fleming tube, and he added headphones and a second battery, or a B battery, from the plate. There's the battery, the headphones, back to the cathode, or the filament, and this allowed the dots and dashes to be heard in earphones. Well, what's the significance of that? The significance of that is that as soon as voice transmission was available, you'd be able to hear it. You couldn't hear it with Fleming's device, so what DeForest really did was very significant. It's very small, and if you read any patent, it always says, I have found a new and useful, or a new and different use for something, and so he, by adding the B battery in the earphone, and then eventually adding the third element, which we know as the grid, to make the 3-element tube, was able to make something that went beyond Edison and went beyond Fleming. I mean, they all had a purpose, but as you'll see in my book, and as you probably know because you're electronics oriented people, that every inventor, Steve Jobs included, looks at what came before and says, how can I improve this and make it a consumer experience? Or how can I sell more of these? How can I do a patent that will bypass the courts, and won't get sued for it? So every inventor does that. So I talk about that in the book. DeForest was significant in radio. He was an early radio broadcaster. The newspaper record, this article in the Times, was March 1907. It talks about DeForest broadcasting music to the Times Tower. And this is a 1907 phonograph. You see, again, every device that was invented always used the previous device as a model. So DeForest, for a radio telephone, used a telephone transmitter, carbon microphone. This is how they did it. There's a phonograph, and it looks like attached to the back of the phonograph is some sort of carbon microphone acoustic coupler to send record music. And then there's an ARC. He used an ARC transmitter. The interesting thing about this is, and it was quoted in this March 8th, 07 article, it said, Dr. DeForest began experimenting with his present apparatus last December. Well, what does that mean? Who else was experimenting with the radio telephone? Fessenden, the famous Fessenden 1906 Christmas Eve broadcast. The problem with Fessenden, and this is where DeForest kind of overwhelms every inventor because he always courted the press. Fessenden hated the press. He was a crotchety guy, if you can believe that. And Fessenden, and again, how do we know what we know? To answer that question again, how do we know that Fessenden did the Christmas Eve broadcast of 1906? Well, Fessenden said so, but not until 1930 in his autobiography. And so some recent scientists, there was a big article by Mr. O'Neill in Radio World, a couple of other articles, AWA Journal article a few years ago, saying that I've searched everywhere and I cannot find, this is what the author said, the researchers, cannot find any information in the press about the Fessenden Christmas Eve broadcast. All we know is what Fessenden told us. Now, it probably happened because he had the device, and he was doing it earlier in the month, apparently. But just the idea that, here's something that was 100 years old, and if you don't leave a record, well, there you go.
Well, I grew up in the next town from Marshfield.
Yeah, I don't know.
Well, he did that at Grant Rock, which is part of the town of Marshfield.
But he did something else earlier, which I do have in the book. I have some Fessenden stuff in the book, and I have the Fessenden researcher, Bell Rose, up in Canada, who is kind of counterpoint with some of the other researchers. There's a lot of detail in the book. It's ridiculously big. DeForest also used a radio telephone using an ARC. While he was using his Audion as a receiver. Later on, by 1916, 17, he was using his vacuum tube Oscillion as a transmitter of radio. So he was early in radio. Well, let's look at the locally, because the 1912 in Palo Alto is really important for DeForest because he developed his tube to amplify and to oscillate. Remember, three things: detector, amplify, and transmit, or oscillate. Federal Telegraph was the first Silicon Valley startup. Some Stanford professors financed Cyril Elwell. First, he tried to look at the McCarty patents in San Francisco, spark gap, and said this is too crude, we can't use it. He ended up buying the Polson patents for high power, really high power international code using Polson arc. And we even have those at Preamps Foundation, giant big arcs. But this was founded and funded by Stanford professors. And Elwell liked DeForest. DeForest was out of money as always around that time. And Elwell said, come here, we'll give you a lab, we'll give you assistance, you can do whatever you want, which is really kind of the way Silicon Valley is today. You know, if someone's a superstar, they'll give him space, and you know, hopefully there was an agreement he would get something out of it. But this is what happened for DeForest. Now, sadly, as soon as DeForest got there, he was arrested for probably the second or third time, and this was written in he wrote this in his diary, March 29th, 1912, and he was arrested based on stock fraud for exaggerating the value of the audio. And I have all the court transcripts in the book. The prosecutor said, well, it's not even a good light bulb, right? Because he didn't give him enough light. So
that was Mike Adams, the writer of a recent biography of Dr. Lee DeForest, talking about the early stages of DeForest's life. As promised, at 11 o'clock I'll open up for any feedback, any chat that we might like to have. I'm hoping that either Peter, 3ACZ, or Dave, or any of the other regulars might be there. As the people on the stream can see, I've been running background to that audio-only recording from videos I took looking from the top of the Langham Hotel down across the Yarra with a telephoto lens. And I hope that has provided you with a more attractive picture than the one you're about to see. And I've switched back to internal live transmission from the webcam now. Incidentally, if you want to look in on this QSO, or if you have poor reception of any one of us in the ensuing QSO, which I hope is going to happen in the next few minutes, dial up our YouTube live stream by putting this phrase into Google: VK3AML 17 July 2021. Again, the search phrase VK3AML 17 July 2021, and you should find our live stream, hopefully with audio. Okay, it's 1 minute past 11. I'll now open it up for a QSO, and I'm hoping I've got my leads patched in correctly. I'll just turn up the levels. Hopefully this will work. VK3AML standing by for any calls.
Yeah, ACZ's here as usual.
Have we got any other calls? VK3ACZ, VK3AML with a pause.
And VK3 Echo Charlie Golf.
Nothing else heard, Peter. Would you care to take it for an over? VK3ACZ, VK3 Alpha Mike Lima.
Yeah, VK3AML in the group with VK3ECG on the side, VK3AML. Good evening, Chris. I regret that I didn't give your broadcast the full attention until about 10:30. I've been struggling with the Trans-Tasman contest. Not too well, I might add. Conditions aren't all that great. I got a 5.9 both ways with VK2 in Sydney, but otherwise things have been pretty ordinary at times. But of course we're locked up here in the state of Victoria, and no chance to go portable to get away from all the QR Mary at my home QTH, so I was stuck with having to put up. It's wonderful that we've got something to listen to for a while to take our minds off being slightly confined, and we've also got a rather nice person to talk to, so you're appreciated, Chris. Anyway, back to you, and we can bring Dave in. And also, how has your week been other than that? VK3AML in the group, VK3ACZ.
VK3ACZ and group with VK3CG also there, VK3AML. As you might be able to tell from my voice, I've had a sore throat and an ominously runny nose and a cough. I don't think it's COVID, but I'll certainly be going for a test with Prue. We're in lockdown and can't pass it on in any case, but it seems to have plateaued at a mediocre level of debilitation of me. So fortunately tonight I pre-recorded most of the stuff. Unfortunately we had a stuff up with the audio early on in the transmission of the pre-recorded material because the OBS software is very obscure, and the operation of the audio mixer within OBS has all sorts of traps for young players. A few weeks ago, you might remember, I had a terrible echo problem with playing material because if you activate the wrong channels in the internal virtual mixer of OBS software, it streams to internet direct playback from the video clip that you're playing, plus a stream with 1/10 of a second of digital latency through the sound card. In other words, it's a pain in the neck, and it's also a pain in several items of the anatomy further south. But apart from that, I've been editing a lot of video material and familiarising myself with ways and means of fast video editing for the sake of these Saturday night sessions. And trying to select material that will still have meaning to people on listening on radio, but will have additional meaning for people who can look in at the visuals. And finding that stuff is not all that easy. Conceiving it and producing it's a little bit more easy, but particularly with the lecture on audio devices being sold for the titillation of the vulgar mob, the $130 bottle of coloured rocks, which you are supposed to tape to the USB leads to your computer for better audio, really takes the cake, and the fact that they've sold so many indicates that there is in fact one born every minute. With that, I'll hand it round to to Dave, 3ECG, VK3 Alpha Mike Lima. How has your week been?
Yes, from VK3 Echo Charlie Golf. Good evening, Chris. Good evening, Peter. Yes, well, it's been an interesting week for a number of reasons. Not the least general issues at work, which I'm sort of work very close to where you were at the Langham, actually. It's only about 150, 200 metres from where I work, so I get a wander out that way sometimes to grab a bite to eat at the Southbank or something like that, although I've been doing that far less frequently recently, I must say. But it's a lovely place, and certainly the view is quite dramatic up there. I'll tell you a story about the year 2000 event sometime about fireworks at Southbank, but which was fascinating. But yeah, absolutely. And really, thank you very much for this evening, Chris. It's been really interesting, particularly. I don't know. It's really a consolidation, isn't it? Really, of all of those bizarre audiophile theories. The great thing about, I must say, having a valve amplifier, and I do have one sitting near me here, is the warmth from the valves in a cold room, which hasn't got any other heating. And I found the valves are really quite a convenient sort of local form of heat. Not that they should be used as such, but it certainly seems to work very well. But the theories are incredible. I remember having there was a guy at work who was really into this, and he brought in his whatever it was $250, $300 mains cable, which just plugged into the wall and then into his equipment. And I was sort of looking at this, going, well, but what happens, after it goes into the wall? and this seemed to be a complete piece of irrelevance, which was fascinating to hear. But absolutely, as far as I'm concerned, valve things are quite fun and they look nice. But at the end of the day, the solid state, really good high-class solid state amplifiers are as I think one of the speakers was saying. I mean, just good quality. Even though it may not improve the actual sound, probably has greater longevity in it, and it's probably a bit more reliable from a sort of both a technical and electronic point of view. But the psychology of this is fascinating. I'll perhaps reference something a bit later on about contextual bias in my work and how that fits into the same sort of things we have to face with these subjectivism and so on. Anyway, back to you, Chris, from VK3 Echo Charlie Golf.
Listening for any other breakers, but I couldn't hear any there. VK3ECG, VK3AML. Is it possible, Dave, I'm getting some distortion from you that's not characteristic. Could you be 5 kilohertz off? We're on 147.475. I'm just wondering if you tuned correctly. Back to you, VK3ECG, VK3AML.
Yeah, VK3ECG, you're absolutely correct. I was 5K off. I must have knocked the knob on the radio as I was fiddling with the squelch earlier on. I do apologise. VK3AML, VK3 Echo Charlie Golf.
Well, there's no need to apologise. I'm not that punctilious, but, it just had that asymmetric clipping sound that you tend to get when signals are a little bit on one side. And it is engage brain before putting mouth in gear. It is easy to do, as I've found on occasion. At one stage, I was doing some testing of some odd narrowband television software which generated a lot of high-frequency audio up around 10 kilohertz. And it produced an interesting effect in the radio. When I wound the level up, the high frequencies in the input audio, for some reason completely unknown to me, caused the radio to skip up a channel on its programming. So unfortunately it plonked my test of narrowband television right on top of the VK3REC repeater, which didn't make people terribly happy. I apologised and withdrew, not knowing where the effect had come from, and then tried the test again. Should have known better. It skipped up onto REC, and some people assumed that I was trying to jam REC. But look, with these radios and audio gear, there are all sorts of unpredictables, really. And trying to look after them all, particularly when you're doing stuff live, is a bit much. As you may have detected, I pre-recorded quite a bit this time. I've also worked out what's wrong with the webcam. I was looking at myself in the webcam and thinking, am I suffering from rosacea? Or have I been drinking too much red wine? And I got into the webcam software and discovered that the saturation on the webcam, the colour saturation, was wound flat out. So I've been... I swore off the red wine for 4 weeks as a result of that bloody webcam. Anyway, round to you, Peter, VK3ACZ and the group VK3AML.
Yeah, VK3AML and the group from VK3ACZ. Don't worry, Chris, your secret is safe with us about the plonking. Hi. No. Just a quick comment on your voice, and forgive me, it took you to repeat again that you have a concern or two physically with going along to get a COVID test. It took you to say that a second time for me to remember that you said at the start of the broadcast that you were feeling a little bit poorly and a bit under the weather. And all I can do is assure you that, I didn't look in at the live stream tonight, but your voice, your audio sounds perfect. You've got that radio announcer's voice to kill for almost, and it sounds as glossy and full-toned as ever. So at least if you're not feeling well, at least you're sounding good. And I do regret that I didn't pay enough attention to the broadcast. I had it on the whole time, but I was trying to do two things at once, and you can't really. I like Dave's description there of the valve amplifiers warming up the room. That's I could use that here at the moment because it's 9.3 degrees in here. Yeah, it's middle of winter, of course. We expect that. We're locked up. We're not allowed to go out. I can say one thing, forgive all the complaining. I'm just so glad we don't have a night curfew. That one, for me, I found really difficult to handle. So much relieved that that's not involved. But I really would have loved to have gone portable the last couple of days. My neighbours have got their hydroponics set up going again, so the dirty inverter is putting out noise on all bands, and 10 metres is about the only one that's not got a strength 9 horrible square wave on it. So these are the things you have to live with when you can't get out and go portable. And I don't think that going to play radio would be, even within 5Ks, would be one of the acceptable reasons. Hi. But there you go. Anyway, just to reassure you again, Chris, you're sounding okay, and so glad that you're with us, especially on a night like tonight, a miserable old night where we're stuck indoors. VK3AML in the group, VK3ACZ.
I'm leaving good long pauses in between overs to let anybody in. I'm starting to think I probably should leave it open for a QSO at an early time in the night, like 10:30 rather than 11. A lot of people I've spoken to about the things we do here tell me, oh yes, I get the start of your broadcast, but by 10 o'clock I fall asleep. I don't think they fall asleep because of the broadcast. I think a lot of people on ham radio go to bed at 10 as a matter of habit, which I probably should have done as a young person, otherwise I wouldn't look as craggy and as grey-haired and bald as I am now. Yeah, just doing lots of experiments with video and streaming, as you may have gathered, and I find that my little portable camera does a very creditable job at night, as you may have noticed from the recorded stream I ran over the top of Mike Adams' description of his book on deforest. I just thought it would be a little bit more interesting for people to have a look around Melbourne, particularly for those who are looking in from overseas, and I know that we have a couple of viewers from places like Washington DC and one in London, to see what Australia is like midwinter. And the numbers, even 8 days ago when I was shooting all of that stuff in the city, was down on what it normally is. I imagine now the city would be absolutely deserted. It would be like the other side of the moon. The trouble with this outbreak of the Indian strain, what do they call it, the Delta strain, I think, is that this time it's hit the rural localities as well as the Melbourne metro. So it's become a bit of a worry, particularly as it's a more infectious strain of this horrible thing. Don't know whether you've seen Dave 3ASE's website. Dave always does interesting stuff on his YouTube channel. The last one, apparently Dave was doing a trip up through central New South Wales parks. He was in parks when he heard that night they'd have to get back over the border to Victoria or face 2 weeks of quarantine. So he ran at the fastest possible speed down the Newell Highway to, I think, cross the river near Tocumwal, and was absolutely stunned to find that there was no police presence on the bridge, the major bridge, the Newell Highway bridge, checking people back into Victoria. So obviously even the police were in disarray over that, and I think Dave was justifiably cheesed off at the lack of need for him to push himself so far to get back into Victoria. Although, in retrospect, the way this infection has come to us from a moving van from Sydney and from several other Sydney escapees doing a a runner from Tullamarine Airport. It's about time that there was a bit more police presence in this. I don't think that I'm a lemming for demanding that there should be less movement across the border when Sydney's going through what it is. But certainly Gladys didn't seem to react to it fast enough. And I think it's only slowly dawning on people that we're in another wave, which is not good. I think there were 19 detected COVID infections today. Dave, you're in the medical side of things. You might be able to tell us a bit more about the epidemiology of this. Should we be worried? Should we be isolating ourselves in ways that you might know that the general public hasn't been informed about? I think a lot of this shutting down has to do with avoiding the monopolisation of ICU facilities in the hospitals, so that we don't have to face a situation such as they're facing in Indonesia and India at the moment, running out of oxygen bottles. VK3ECG and the group VK3AML.
Yes, VK3AML and the group V-K3 Echo Charlie Golf. No, you're right. I had seen that thing of VK3ACs, but I didn't watch the whole thing. But it is interesting, and I can understand people's sort of general scepticism. The reality, of course, is that you've got to make a really big choice operationally. If you're going to actually lock down and have a ring of steel approach, then that's really incredibly high intensity of activity, very costly and all the rest, and very disruptive at multiple levels. And you've really got to make a clear choice about whether the particular risk at the time is one that needs to be actually policed at that level. I think that's the general principle, that these things really only work at the end of the day if the community is actually taking the advice and acting on the advice. And unfortunately, with the various strains, if people don't do that, then really, at one level, all the policing in the world will not stop individual outbreaks and individual people doing the wrong thing and then transmitting the virus. That's at least how I take that to mean. I mean, there's lots of other ways of policing processes rather than having physical checkpoints, but that aside, I think at the end of the day, it's down to the community really of actually, sharing the burden, if you like, and trying to reduce the spread. And the only issue about, and I think the issue is Delta, you're absolutely right what you're saying about all of the issues around COVID prevention really are to some extent based on making sure that the intensive care units can operate and are not crippled, if you like, and not so much from just the COVID cases. When we've seen good examples of people being able to expand, or areas being able to expand their sort of high-tech facilities. London, a good example of that, with these sort of temporary hospitals set up with high-level care, but not exactly intensive care. So you can certainly gear those things up, but it's all the other patients who need intensive care therapy, and if the ICUs are full, then of course you start putting a lot of other people's lives at risk, not just from a COVID perspective, I suppose. And the real challenge with the Delta one, as you've heard on the news and so on, is this high rate of transmissibility, and now even with a vaccinated population, you can still acquire the virus in a subclinical way where you don't really have any symptomatology, but you can probably spread even so, even though it may be very low levels of virus being produced. A lot of work still needs to be done to really unpick all that, but the reality is the real challenge is that you're now getting situations where it's really hard to understand the connection, and literally people going past each other in a corridor or whatever, and that can simply be enough. And so that's where the real, I think, risk comes in But at the end of the day, it's a community that makes the decision. It's a community that prevents it. Really, all the experts can do is guide and put the advice and the rules in place. But if they're not followed, then well, we've seen what will happen. It's pretty much as simple as that in a way. But there we are. No, I love the pictures from Melbourne. It's really gorgeous up there. My recollection of the year 2000 was that I work not too far from the Langham, although we're not. We're only a sort of 2.5, 3-story building, and as a consequence, we've got a large flat roof. And the year 2000 with all the fireworks, and I happened to be at work at midnight for operational reasons, and I remember we sort of took a break and had a coffee break and all wandered up to the roof on the building and watched the fireworks, a little bit obscured by a lot of the high-rises around, but it's still a very, very nice view. So it was certainly a really interesting. It certainly is an interesting place to be, particularly to watching all the fireworks displays down by the river and things like that. Much better than in the big, massive crowds and so on. Back to you, Chris. VK3AML in the group, VK3 Echo Charlie Golf.
VK3 Echo Charlie Golf in the group, VK3AML. I just have another question to throw at you, Dave. It's come from the list, the chat box at the side of the YouTube studio. Dan, I presume VK3DTM, has asked me to ask you, and I'll read it out, why have they banned ivermectin, IVERMECTIN, which I haven't heard of, I must admit, when Aussie scientists were one of the first teams to prove its efficacy? I haven't heard of ivermectin. Do you have any information on that, Dave, before I hand it back to Peter? VK3ECG, VK3AML.
Yes, VK3AML, VK3 Echo Charlie Golf. Yeah, it is interesting, and there's lots of these various things that are being used and talked about, and one of my cousins sent me this very interesting picture from India where someone was making sort of compound pills that contained ivermectin and a whole variety of other things. There was vitamin D, and there was a whole heap of things which were sort of treatment and preventatives and things like that. I mean, the difficulty is there are a lot of things that might work in certain situations and work in the test tube and so on and things like that, but whether they actually work requires a proper study. And I don't believe that we've got the sort of positive results. Look, it's not an area I've looked into specifically myself, but the challenge is much more complex than that. And there's a lot of studies and so on to come through, but I mean, all I know is that a lot of work has been done on trying to find the most effective way of managing individuals, and they work on the basis of what has been proven to achieve good benefit, and sometimes things you think that really would, at the end of the day, don't have the sort of benefits that make them worthwhile using. So there's a whole heap of things like that, but specifically I've not looked at this in great detail, so I can't answer it in any specific way at all. VK3AML and the group, VK3 Echo Charlie Golf.
I leave a bit of a gap there in case anybody else would like to come in, and if anybody's listening on the stream, the YouTube stream, who'd like to join us on 147.475 megahertz on 2 meters, that is 147.475. Feel very free to join in the conversation if you're within range of us here on 2 meters, or indeed by giving feedback on the chat box next to the YouTube live stream. And for those who may have a ropey reception of us via radio, you can get us on the YouTube live stream by Googling this phrase, VK3AML 17 July 2021. Dan VK3DTM also asked, why ban doctors from prescribing ivermectin? I presume it's because tests have not gone through. I don't know. I'll hand it round to Peter, VK3ACZ. It's interesting investigating all of these possible solutions that haven't been pursued, eh, Pete? VK3ACZ and group, VK3AML.
VK3BJS.
Acknowledging Jeff, and we'll hand it round to Peter first.
Yeah, roger that. The VK3AML in the group from VK3ACZ, and good evening, Jeff. You're coming through nice and clear here into suburban Baronia. Yeah, well, and I know nothing about ivermectin either. Hi. Because it's the elephant in the room, I might make this one over to do with COVID, since it's been mentioned. I hope there were no shortwave listeners or any other hams listening to the Sherbrooke 80-metre net this morning. The whole hour and a bit was covered with theories and ideas and varying views about the whole sorry business. And the only thing I really keep coming back to is that am I the only one who feels that this is an incredible reaction to something that it seems the vast majority of people aren't even going to be symptomatic? Yes, do I want to be one of the ones that it really bites? Well, of course not, but I'm still wondering. I'm yet to be convinced, and if anybody wants to help me to understand why we have this severe reaction to something that statistically doesn't seem to be as dangerous as pneumonia, but and you'll have to forgive me because I watched my dad succumb to pneumonia untreated because of his age and other medical issues that seem to be untreatable as well. I've watched people in nursing homes go under for the same reason. Antibiotics have not been given and nature's been allowed to take its course. Now, I gather that for some people COVID really is pretty awful, but again, I hope I'm making sense. It's just that we're really committing to a huge number of resources. We're really going to a lot of difficulty and financial hardship and all the rest of it for it. Now, finance is the only thing in life that matter? Well, no, of course not. But anyway, look, that's my little 2 cents, and I throw that out there not to be argumentative, but to invite somebody to persuade me that what we're doing is reasonable and justified, because I'm just here scratching my head trying to figure it all out. Back over to you, Chris, and you can invite Jeff in, VK3AML in the group, VK3ACZ.
Yeah, no worries, Peter. Thanks for that. Yeah, I can understand people being frustrated with it, but and we're certainly avoiding the lockdown on the basis that the Brits have at the moment. I'm just looking on my Facebook page. A friend of mine, Russ Anderson, who's a folk singer, he says, and I'll read this out, last night an expat retired nurse friend in Hull, UK, messaged me about their situation. Monday, 19th July, and all restrictions will be lifted. No masks, no social distancing, nothing. We've been in lockdown since March 2020, came out for 8 weeks in August, then went back into lockdown in September 2020, and haven't come out since 18 months in lockdown. Her opinion was that they're using the UK population as guinea pigs now. The UK infections are 34,000 plus every day. The hospitals are overloaded. We're being let out to see if we can survive or die. That's the comment from the nurse in England. So it's a very different situation over there. I think they're dead terrified that it'll run away from them here. And I think the ICU beds are very limited. What is becoming obvious to me is that during this pandemic crisis, governments willing to exercise some sort of collective control, and generally that's Labor in Australia's case, have a bit more chance of suppressing the waves of infection peaks than, you know, the laissez-faire Conservatives of Gladys, whatever her second name is, I can't pronounce it, Berejiklian, I don't know. But without the suppression of the peak, the ICUs become overloaded like Indonesia or India, and that really, I think, is one of the things that they're trying to do with this lockdown. Whether or not it's justified on the basis of that, I can't really say, but I will say this. I personally leave the decision to the medical experts who know. I wouldn't even venture an opinion as to whether we're locked down, and I wouldn't get angry about it. We're in other people's hands here, and it depends on whether you trust those hands. It's not the politicians driving this, it's the medical experts informing the politicians. Over to VK3, that's my soapbox for the night. VK3VJS, over to you, Jeff, VK3AML.
Yes, okay, Chris, and good evening to everybody listening. I was listening to the broadcast. Wash your mouth out with Solvol, Jeff. The test transmission. And on one screen I was watching Macbeth via satellite. Watching, not listening. What a bloodthirsty show that is. At Shakespeare, he was a bloodthirsty character. And a classic old western on the other screen. Once Upon a Time in the West, with Charles Bronson, Henry Fonda and Jason Robards and Claudia Cardinal. So I was listening to most of your test transmissions, Christopher. Found it very interesting. I'll have to go out and get some of that special speaker wire, and then I might be able to hear my Barry White CDs a lot better, more resonance, and his deep voice will knock me out of the room. Love my Barry White. Anyway, Chris, I'm playing by the rules. I'm not phased by it, even though I'm 81. I've been left out, like a lot of people over 75. We never get a mention. I think we're dispensable. I haven't been tested or anything, and I still haven't made up my mind about the injection yet, what type to use. I've got to see the doctor next week to get new scripts for my ailments, which are only relatively minor, type 2 diabetes and high blood pressure, whatever. But I'm surviving. As you know, Chris has been here a couple of times and always left very impressed. I live here on my own, and I'm 81, nudging 82. I do everything for myself, even still drive my truck, and I haven't had a flu injection in my life. The last injections I've had was at Blackrock State School for probably poliomyelitis and chicken pox and mumps, if I can remember rightly. So I'm not afraid of injections. I've had more needles stuck in me than a voodoo doll. At any rate, I'm not going to hold it. I'm watching another show here with Charles Bronson. He's in the rag trade this time, and he's sorting things out in the rag trade. That was one of my jobs many years ago in the rag trade as well, which led to a full 44 years driving medium and heavy rigid trucks and loving it. So all the best, Chris. Keep up the good work, as I've said before. And the other two chaps who can hear me, and probably young Terry as well. All the best to everybody. I didn't even fire up the tablet, Chris, because I had the other two screens going. VK3AML and the group VK3VJS.
When he remembers to put his microphone gain up. Thanks, Jeff. VK3VJS and group VK3AML. And I know what you mean by the bloodthirsty nature of Shakespeare. Gosh, it was one night my wife and I went to see a double Shakespeare show on on the same bill, King Lear and Macbeth. And we met an elderly friend of ours as we're on the way out of the first session and back in for the second. She said, after seeing King Lear gouge his own eyes out and knowing what the end of Macbeth was going to be, she said, just make sure you don't go near any cliffs because I think you'll be tempted to jump off. You're probably having the most depressive night of your life watching this stuff. There are some of them that are good, like Much Ado About Nothing is very refreshing stuff. But King Lear, oh dear. Interesting what you say about the Anaconda leads. There is actually a speaker lead manufacturer called Anaconda, and the leads literally, they funnel out from the amplifier until they're literally a bunch of cables, something like 2 inches thick. And this thing snakes literally across your floor to the speakers. Anything more ridiculous I can't think of. I think Douglas Self dealt very summarily with that. You can probably do a little bit better than twisted figure of 8 power cable costing you 10 cents a foot, or 10 cents a metre, I should say. But for some of the ridiculous extremes they go to, just incredible. I'll hand it back to Dave, VK3CG. And I'm just looking at the list. There's quite a discussion going on the YouTube chat box between Dennis, the avid YouTube watcher, who's VK1DKO, I presume, in Canberra from that call sign, and Dan, VK3DTM, and Dennis is saying, with the federal government, almost 30% of GDP and debt will be paying this off for decades. I don't know about that. Certainly there'll be a dive in GDP whenever we have a shut-in, but it seems to be compensated to some extent by the backlash when everybody gets out of the shut-in. Certainly as soon as we could, we got out to stay at the Langham. I should explain that video that I ran was a product of Prue, my wife, getting stir-crazy from being at home without doing major trips for about 3 months. And she started ringing around the city hotels, and sure enough, she found that there were all sorts of good deals going at the city hotels, because with interstate travel out of the question, they were screaming for people to occupy their rooms to at least give their staff something to do. So we got a very good rate on a room at the Langham. And then when we got there, they immediately upgraded us to an executive suite on the 19th floor, which is why I got those wonderful view videos. So that's the thing there. VK3DTM says in the chat box that he works in hospitals as a contractor, and he says that many of them were empty during the peak of the first wave. And many of the deaths that happened at that time were elective surgeries that were put off. So it's very, very hard to plan during this wave. I've had the first AstraZeneca injection, no side effects that I can detect, and I'm waiting for the second one, I think in about 2 weeks' time. But I've no ill effects, he said. If you hear me croaking and making noises like I'm having a final heart attack, that's likely to be the AstraZeneca side effect. Anyway, I'll hand it round to Dave, VK3CG. Over to you, Dave, VK3CG, VK3AML.
Yes, VK3AML, VK3ECG. and the group. Look, it's fascinating. But yes, your voice is a little gruff, but as one might expect for this time of the year with these ordinary things going around, it's actually quite interesting how, in fact, the influenza's dropped, of course, because so many people have been taking so much additional sort of viral precautions, if you like, and that's one of the sort of side effect, if you like, of the lockdowns, which is one of the good features about it, really, because influenza really is a nasty thing to get. Totally different from the common cold, but there we are. Now, I'll get back on some of the other things about subjective stuff in hi-fi and so on. I mean, it is fascinating, and when you think about those biases which were talked about, which are really fascinating, about this whole sense of contextual bias and the sorts of things that make people hear things in a particular way. And they do, and yes, I mean, I'm sure there's not so much buyer regret, but buyer enthusiasm. If you've paid a lot of money for something, then clearly you're going to be listening for every possible little advantage it's giving you, even if you may not, in a completely random and double-blind approach, actually be able to recognise the difference. Many things sound different when you change components in an audio system, but that doesn't mean to say that the sound is better or worse. If you do it in a really blind way, it may be very difficult to tell. Contextual bias is really interesting, and it's certainly affected my profession a great deal, and that is, how do you, if you're given lots of information about say a forensic type case, and you know that all in advance of what people believe happened, then yes, you are more likely to tend to confirm from your own observations that what they believe has happened is likely to be true. And this whole issue of contextual bias is really a real challenge, and you'd think it would be only in the sort of opinion areas, but actually can affect quite a lot of measuring type areas as well, when you're relying on a human individual to look at matching heights of peaks and looking at error rates and things like that. So it is interesting. And what's the modern technique for doing this is a situation called sequential unmasking, which is where you give a person almost nothing to work on, just the bare science work they're doing, and then once they've concluded from the first stage, you then start giving them some information, say, well, if we put it to you, it might have happened like this. What's your opinion of that? And this actually tends to get people to be less affected by that contextual thing, and they sequentially unmask the information. And it's the same thing that we do these days in fact, in audit and if you like, case review. The same sort of process takes place. So instead of giving someone the entire case to review, we just give them the bare observed facts. They all have their own biases, of course, and then they comment and reanalyze that, and then you give them the questions that the people were asking, and to see whether the science confirms or refutes those questions or ideas, and you just break those down bit by bit over time, and that's actually really a fascinating way of doing it. So it won't completely remove these things, but it's a way of trying to actually contain them. It sort of comes down to sort of what I call the black box theory. Something's coming into a black box and something's going out of a black box. Data's going in and ideas or opinions are coming out. But what goes inside the black box, what goes on in that process, is actually really quite difficult to work out, and is subject to all kinds of weird sort of psychological and other factors and influences, and it turns out to be quite a lot more complicated than people perhaps thought. Actually, Shakespeare's quite a good example. You can do quite a lot of interesting sort of forensic-y things on the things that happen in Shakespeare, and I've got a lovely little book actually, not just on that, but how Shakespeare's. There's a wonderful book of Shakespearean insults, which is definitely should be on everyone's bookshelf, and there's a special subset of doctor insults in Shakespeare, which are truly magnificent examples of understanding various bits about the human body and the foibles of the quacks. Anyway, Chris, back to you. VK3AML and the group, and good evening to you, Jeff. VK3 Echo Charlie Golf.
VK3CG and the group VK3AML. This thing of expected results and buyer expectations certainly affects things that I know I buy, and I hope to get better results from them. And if not, I get very disappointed. In one example of that was I heard a demonstration of D-Star with its heavily compressed audio when it was first released on the Australian market, I think 2008, 2006, something like that. 3M showed me a rig, and the sound to me sounded watery and full of digital artifacts. Much worse than NBFM, even in its 300 Hz to 3K iteration. And having bought the D-Star rig, Lionel couldn't believe that I would reject it. He said, it's crystal clear. And I could hear that it wasn't. I mean, I thought, what is this? Is this the Emperor's New Clothes? And a whole group of amateurs that I knew were persuaded that this was clearer when I could clearly hear that it wasn't half as clear. In fact, it was better sig to noise than most analogue radio that I'd heard, but if you listened closely, you found that the codec was reproducing so poorly, you couldn't understand half the words. And it still strikes me as being a bit of the Emperor's New Clothes. People pay a lot of money for it and are persuaded almost by the amount of money that they've paid that it's better. I would question whether it's applicable to the amateur service at all, whether in using, for example, normal NBFM, the way I'm doing it, directly modulating without frequency response limitation of any great extent, the voltage-controlled oscillator in my rig, and getting good audio response down to 30 Hz and maybe up to about 8K, whether there's any point in going to a digital system that's brick-walled at 3 kHz and is full of digital artifacts. So a lot of these things come under the heading the Emperor's New Clothes. I remember a friend of mine who may actually be listening, so she'll know who I'm talking about, an otherwise highly scientifically clued up person, buying 4 little pyramid feet sold at very high cost to elevate your loudspeaker enclosure off the floor. And she was convinced that the sound was greatly improved by these. I honestly couldn't tell any difference, except that probably in the way that the lecturer earlier tonight talked about the shifting of the sound source with regard to the walls, that probably it varied the standing waves of audio, the reflections across the room, and therefore varied the frequency response slightly. And if it made her happy, well, as that guy said, it's your money. But I personally wouldn't pay $200 for 4 brass feet, 1.5 inches long, to go on the bottom of my speakers. If I wanted to do that, I'd put 4 blocks of wood there. Oh dear. But, you know, just the fact that people pay these huge amounts, I think, convinces some people that it actually works. Power cord that you mentioned is one of them. Contextual bias, yeah. In terms of measuring, an interesting sideline here, I think. Years ago, I flattered as a tenant to a guy who was in national parks in Launceston in Tasmania. I was there for a better part of 12 months, 1982 to 3. And he spent a lot of his time on top of the plateau of Ben Lomond in the northeast of Tasmania, up about the 5,000 foot level. And a lot of botanists and meteorologists go up there with instruments because it's one of the highest contiguous plateaus in Tasmania, large plateaus. And he said that several of them went up there with sets of 3 instruments, 3 aneroid barometers, 3 thermometers, 3 of everything. And he explained to me, if they have one and it doesn't look right, they have no idea whether it's wrong. If they have 2 thermometers or barometers and one is wrong, they don't know which one is wrong. If they have 3 and 2 indicate the same measurement and one is off, they know which one's wrong. I think it's a very expensive and bulky way of going about it, though. I'll hand it round to Jeff, VK3VJS, if you're still there, Jeff. If not, around to Peter. So, Jeff, are you still with us? VK3VJS, VK3AML.
Yes, I'm still here, Chris, but I'm listening with interest, so I won't come back apart from this one. And thank you very much again. Your test transmissions are always very rewarding, Chris, even to a layman like me. A truck-driving layman. I still enjoy it, Chris. And all the best to you and Prue and all the other people on the channel. David, I think it is, and I can't think of the other surname. Christian name, sorry. But all the best to all. Keep up the good work, Chris, and we'll catch up with you real soon. VK3AML and the group VK3VJS. Good evening.
No worries, Jeff. And one of the things I want to pursue with these Saturday night transmissions, now that I know I can record viable video, is to interview people who've been involved with radio, particularly those who've been involved with radio in interesting ways for a long period. And you are on the list. Dun, 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 dun. So you better hope that the shut-in stays, the lockdown stays for a few weeks yet. VK3 ACZ and group VK3AML.
Yeah, VK3AML and group VK3ACZ. Oh, what is all this technical talk? Anybody would think it's ham radio or something. What's going on? Yeah, well, you got me feeling rather nervous. The whole idea of audio quality reminds me of, in fact, it was only yesterday. Now, I have very little HF that I can do at the moment for the aforementioned reason with the QR Mary and nasty dirty inverters. But I did hear a fellow brushing the dust off a brand new FTD X10, and an American station on 20 metres was persuading him that it needed some work on the compression and he needed to get into the processing. And I was thinking, oh my goodness, he sounds absolutely audio quality, 110% beautiful. And here's somebody advising him, no, it's all wrong, it's all wrong. And yes, I do know that punchy audio gets through on HF sideband a lot better with weak signals and all that. I understand all that, but it seems to be simply in the eye of the beholder, and it seems no two people seem to agree. So you'll forgive me for feeling a bit nervous about the whole subject. But if I can just go back to the COVID situation, as I said before, it's the elephant in the room, just for a few more moments, and nothing controversial. I was just thinking that I've been speaking to some stateside stations who report to me that from the time they're fully vaccinated, any restrictions like masks and curfews and the such like are gone. They're left to the people who've not yet been vaccinated. And don't ask me how you would ever possibly police that or scrutinise it in any way, but that's what they report. It would be nice if we were allowed some kind of liberty of that kind. I had my first AstraZeneca just like you did, Chris, on the basis, that I hope it frees us for international travel eventually, and it doesn't sound like it will. But it'd be nice not to have to wear a mask too, considering we're vaccinated. And I know there are other issues involved. But I'm so glad to hear you didn't have any reaction. I did. I convinced myself in advance that any reaction at all would be psychosomatic and therefore, all in the head. So was convinced I was well prepared to have an asymptomatic time, but and it wasn't to be. I had 2 days of really fluey aches and feeling rather off colour and unpleasant. But perhaps the second one will be a lot better, because I've been hearing, albeit anecdotal stories, that the second visor will make you ill where the first one may not, and vice versa with AstraZeneca. Well, here's hoping. And the subject of influenza, that name came up before, and I'm reminded I get really impatient with people who say, oh, yeah, I had the flu. And no, what they're talking about is a minor cold, just some simple little head cold. No. When you've got influenza, you can't scratch yourself, and at first you worry you're going to die, then you worry that you might not. I've had influenza once, and I certainly don't want to repeat it. So I line up quite happily for the vaccination in the hope that it'll prevent me feeling as bad as I did the previous time. So anyway, that's my little take on that. I'll try to stick back on the subject of technical stuff. I'm sure I've done COVID to death now, at least for tonight. We're stuck with it no matter what happens. And a good advice that you gave there before too, Chris, to me, that you'll trust the medical people. And I'm not sure whether the politicians are driving it, but I'd say that's fairly good advice. I hope there aren't an equal number of, like with climate change, I'd hope we don't have a number of people giving the opposite view, and it's up to us to just pick and choose which one we want. I really do hope there's some point in what we're experiencing at the moment. But anyway, enough of my waffling. Back to you, Chris. And yeah, your test broadcasts every Saturday night are wonderful. Jeff is right. VK3AML and group, VK3ACZ.
Well, I'm glad it keeps somebody happy. And I'd say by the numbers that I'm seeing on Facebook, which, let's see, we peaked at 16 viewers at 11:40 p.m. We're now at 13. There have been 57 viewers through in the 3 hours. And the average number of hits I get per week on each of these transmissions, which are recorded on YouTube inherently by going live, averages out between 120 and 200 hits. So it's interesting somebody who I can't actually say. It's an interesting experiment from my point of view to extend this to YouTube Live. It was actually 3SL, Steve Langley, who gave me the push to use OBS software and all the rest of it, but Steve is not to any extent concentrating on the video side. He's purely sticking with audio streaming with a single still up, which makes it a bit easier. I've decided to give it a try and push it into a bit of variety with video material, and as people can see, I succeed and have errors. We had a flaw with the streaming of the audio early tonight for about 5 minutes. And good night to Terry Sims. I see he's just dropping off the to have a bit of a sleep. VK3FTJS. Nice to see you there, Terry. Well, you can see me. I can't see you. Not unless this does something I'm not aware of. What is interesting is each week I'm pushing the OBS software a bit further. I've now got the streaming hiccups that we originally had completely ironed out, and the audio echo problem I think is ironed out. It's just a matter of keeping enough video material going up to the stream each week to fill the 90 minutes worth of pre-recorded stuff at the start, and then about an hour's worth of of chat at the finish, which is more the point to the situation. So if anybody on the YouTube stream would like to come up and join the chat, you'd be very welcome. If you have a ham radio transmitter and can come on 147.475, or if there are people listening on 2 meters who'd like to look in just the last little bit of our transmission tonight, you can Google VK3AML 17 July 2021, and that should take you by Google to our YouTube live stream, which includes a video component and reasonable quality audio, I think. That's VK3AML 17 July 2021, and I see the numbers just popped up by 1 to 14, so somebody heard us. Anyway, who do we put it round to now? I think it's Dave. VK3, correct me if I'm wrong, Dave. VK3ECG to take VK3AML.
Yeah, VK3 Echo Charlie Golf. I'm not sure there was another station there, but I could. It's just very, very scratchy noise. Chris, did you hear anything? VK3 ECG.
I heard nothing, but I'll just drop the squelch down and see if anybody's there. VK3AML just standing by. Oh, there might be somebody there, but they're down in the noise. And hello to Brendan O'Day on the YouTube stream. One of many there. Dan VK3DTM I see is there. He's saying that the AstraZeneca vaccine is experimental. Well, it's been approved by quite a few medical authorities. So, and in my age group, I'm sufficiently at 67. I'm subject to attack by COVID to such an extent that it's good to get some sort of inoculation into me, and I'm acting under the advice of a good family friend and a GP, Rosie Rosie Sanderson, who was the daughter of Tony Sanderson, who was the original VK3AML. And I'm sure if there was any question of danger with me, that she would not, as a friend for her entire life, take any chances. Matt Bird is turning in. Good night, Matt. A lot of people are dropping off just at midnight. I suppose it's the witching hour. And I will myself in a few minutes' time, although the numbers have now peaked at 16. Wow, that's the best of the night, right on midnight. I'll hand it back to Peter. I think we'll probably go round for a final now, unless somebody else can break in. VK3ACZ with a pause for any breakers, VK3AML.
Yeah, VK3AML in the group VK3ACZ, yeah, nothing heard. And what I am hearing is a very heavy patter of rain on the roof again. It's one of those wild and woolly nights, isn't it? A good night to be rugged up indoors. Showers going across from the southwest for most of the evening. But nothing more to add. I might just go back to listening. I'm happy to hang around as long as you're going to be here, but can't think of anything else to contribute at this stage, other than that I'm glad that you're getting some good feedback and listener numbers via the video stream. And I was very tempted to go back into the house and get my mobile phone to add another one to your watcher numbers, but I'll have to do that next week. Anyway, back over to you, Chris, VK3AML and group VK3ACZ.
Okay. I might add, for anybody who'd like to contact us through the week, you can by sending an email to vk3aml@optusnet.com.au. That's myself, VK3AML, at optusnet.com.au. And if you have any suggestions for the broadcast, for the transmission, for the test transmission or whatever, if you have any suggestions of subjects to cover or people that we could interview on video or otherwise, Peter VK3YE is high on my list of people to be interviewed once I can get out of this COVID lockdown, to not just to fill in a few hours of a Saturday night, but I think as time goes on and these things are recorded, it's building up some sort of a information resource of its own type, ephemeral though it might be. So again, the email to write to me if you'd like to, VK3AML at optusnet.com.au, and that should reach myself or my wife. What's the time now? 12:08 a.m. I'll hand it round to you, Dave. I think I might make this the final round. I'm feeling quite fatigued, having had the snuffles, sore throat. It's probably unrelated to COVID or anything. It's much more likely to be just a plain old cold. But it does take the stuffing out of you, particularly when you can't get out to do reasonable exercise. I mean, the weather has a lot more to do with that than anything else. It has been dismal and wet the last couple of days. I haven't been able to even get out with the motor mower to do a decent cut of the front lawn. Round to you for a final, perhaps, Dave. VK3CG and group VK3AML. Oh, I meant to ask, have you caught up with Steve, 3SL of recent times, Dave? I haven't seen him for a month or two now. VK3CG, VK3AML.
Yeah, VK3AML and the group VK3 Echo Charlie Golf. I saw Stephen Cates would be about 3 or 4 weeks ago. One of our mutual friends, constant launch of his CD, and that we both rolled up to it. So it was at the con just near my building, as where I work as well. So it was a really convenient thing. It's lovely to see them again. But other than that, I haven't seen him in the last few weeks. I've heard him on occasionally, and I think it was on AM on Top Band this evening, which was interesting, of course. But yeah, no, I haven't caught up with him more recently than that. Just closing. I'm going to make this my final as well. I'm just closing on a few things that you said. I mean, your D-Star thing is fascinating. I mean, I've experimented as well, and because it sort of comes with some of the icon things these days, and absolutely agree with you. I mean, it's a very different type of audio. It's an audio you need to sort of get your brain attuned to. It's a bit like the days before we had. Sideband was easy to decode when you had the old, straightforward BFOs without product detectors and things like that, and it was where it could be a bit of a challenge until, especially on some of these very old ex-military shortwave receivers and things like that, and it's a bit like that in a sense, but there's no doubt that the sort of interference issues and signal noise issues are totally different, but it's just a different sound. At the end of the day, radio is about communicating, and as long as you've got that useful communication structure, then that's fine. If it doesn't, well, then it isn't achieving its purpose. On the other hand, there are some significant advantages. Once you move into digital modes, of course, you can move those across different sorts of areas of internet and communication like that as well, which, of course, you can do with analog, but it requires additional layers and things like that. Yes, I like the idea of the different measuring instruments and the thermometers. Always reminds me of the sort of standard joke about the policeman in the pub and the case going to court, and there was a fight between two men in the bar with a man was armed with a stool and was hitting each other with it, and the magistrate said to the policeman, "Why didn't you try to stop the fight?" And the policeman said, "Well, there wasn't a third stool." And I, but I'm not entirely sure whether three measuring instruments are in fact an appropriate way of actually determining that the science and measurement is actually correct. But we'll go that another time. But okay, thanks very much. It's been a wonderful evening. I really enjoyed listening to some great topics, and again, all the wonderful fallacies of the ridiculous audiophile adventures in marketing, which is really what it sort of is in a way. But I'm no doubt will be endlessly offered all kinds of fascinating extra cabling and expensive bits and pieces, but some of the ones are just absolutely wonderful and so extreme that they're just laughable. Anyway, good evening everyone, and have a peaceful rest of the weekend, and chat again sometime soon. This is VK3 Echo Charlie Golf, now signing with VK3AML and all of the others. Good evening to you, Peter and Jeff, and all the best. Cheers.
Okay, before we close completely, is there anybody else who'd like to call in before we conclude? VK3AML, standing by, listening.
I'll just give my final two, Chris.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, VK3AML and the group VK3ACZ. Yeah, good evening, Jeff, Dave, whoever else is listening, and thanks again for being there again tonight, Chris. As I keep saying, even more important when we're indoors with nowhere to go, no parties to attend, nothing. Oh yeah, and I'm just hearing the rain come down harder again. But anyway, best wishes with your COVID test and all that. Hope it all goes smoothly, and it's nothing more than a nagging little cold that'll be over in a day or two. He's hoping anyway. And just one last thing, the lock-up prevented Jim and a few of the rest of us from the Sherbrooke Club going along to, we were heading off on Monday to Mount Alexander near Bendigo for another one of our radio camps, so that's been postponed for a little bit. Hey, at some stage maybe we can talk you into coming along to one of these, but because they're a lot of fun. Anyhow, cheers and 7-3 to you, and look forward to doing it all again next week. VK3AML from VK3ACZ. Good night all.
Yeah, thanks a lot for taking part, Peter. It's really appreciated. And the way it's going with the 19 people detected infections today, it's not looking good for the next Sherbrooke meeting where I'm supposed to be giving this talk on optical communications. I certainly can do it, but I've got a feeling that the shut-in is going to be a lot more than 5 days, the way the infection numbers are going. And Ian, on the chat box beside the YouTube live studio, asks, will I be moving towards Skype call-ins? It would be great to hear Laurie and others back. I'll look into that, but at the moment I've got video replay, OBS software and YouTube Live all running simultaneously, and I'm not quite sure how many more programs I can run on the one computer before the damn thing crashes. So I might experiment with that. Actually, on the second computer, which is on my right, if you're looking on the stream, you can probably see it there. That one we'll probably... I may be able to run Skype on that and somehow feed the audio from it through. But I know that Dave always had trouble with mix minus on Skype feedback without getting great confusion mixing in people from the air with people with Skype's latency. And I don't think 3SL is actually using Skype. He's using the Talkie app, which has much less latency. Anyway, with that, this is VK3 Alpha Mike Lima in East Burwood on YouTube live stream, as well as 147.475, saying all the best to everybody. We'll be back at Saturday at 9:30 p.m. Melbourne time next Saturday with the next instalment of this, with hopefully more home video of various types and material to interest both audio and ham radio people. Thanks very much for the people on the stream: Dan, VK3DTM, Brendan O'Day, Matt Bird, Ian, Dennis from Canberra, just looking through the others here, John Young, Troy Boy, Terry Sims, Dave Ranson, who of course is on there, John Young. Gee, we've had a lot of call-ins during this, 66 call-ins in total, 367 now through the night. And so YouTube Live is going very well. No dropped frames whatever. The stream has been totally continuous and trouble-free, except for my stupidity and fading down the audio on the first 5 minutes. Can't have it all. Anyway, all the best, people, and we'll see you next week.